Ezekiel 33:3.
Okay, welcome. Today we're going to be taking a lot at the Hebrew holidays. We'll be going through all of them actually. So by the end of today, you'll know all the Hebrew holidays. At least you'll know the names. You'll know when they fall throughout the year. And we're going to do some careful scrubbing to kind of figure out what's the difference between a Christian holiday versus a Jewish holiday. I hear this conversation quite a bit, and I know there's a lot of confusion on it. So I just want to do a lesson where we can kind of iron that out so you can see what exactly those two streams are, and then what's the history to kind of support that. So the agenda for today, in the Old Testament, did people do away with the holy days or the law? So at the same time Moses was given the law, the 10 commandments, he was also given the holy days and the details of how to build the tabernacle. We're going to take a look to see if there was anything in the Old Testament to do away with this practice. We're also going to take a look and see all the holy days that are mentioned in the Bible. So what are all the holy days? Are all the holy days mentioned, are there holy days mentioned in the Apocrypha? So the Apocrypha were the 14 books that sat between the Old and New Testament. We're going to see if there are any holy days mentioned in there. And then what details do we have surrounding the birth of Christ? We're going to go through the Bible and find out all that content. Where did we get the word Christmas? We'll pull that as well. We'll take a look at when was Christmas first celebrated. So we'll compare the world, the church, see if there's a difference. And then when was Christmas first celebrated within the church? And then where did the traditions of Christmas come from? Because they didn't all just kind of show up at the same time. They came progressively over time and kind of entered. And then what is the history of Christmas? So those are the ideas we're going to be taking a look at. And we'll probably have to break this into two parts, but we'll see how much we can get done today. We will take a break at about 1 o'clock. We'll take 15 minutes to kind of bio break, stretch the legs kind of thing. But yeah, that's the information we're going to try to get through today. So we're going to start off with the holy days and the law in the Old Testament. So this is a pretty good outline kind of showing you the books of the Bible in the Old Testament and the order that they go in. Because remember, of course, not everything's necessarily chronological. So just because a book in the Bible comes after a specific book, it doesn't mean that those books are ahead of each other or behind each other. So if we take a look here, we can see here we have to start with Genesis. And when Moses received the law and the feast days, he received them in Exodus, and then we heard them again in Leviticus. So here's Exodus right here. As they're going to the promised land, or even before that, we can see that Moses received the law and the feast days. So went up on the mountain, received the 10 commandments, received the feast days, the blueprints for the tabernacle. All the people are at the bottom of the mountain. Then we see here some of the highlights. So they were in the wilderness, and we know they were in the wilderness during these days here, just before Joshua. Joshua is when they came into the promised land. And then we have the Judges, Ruth, Samuel, 2 Samuel, and then we have our first king. Well, actually, Saul was our first king, but we have King David here. And then after King David, we can see that there is this period where the kingdom divides into north and south. North and south was under Solomon. So basically, you had one kingdom that was the northern kingdom called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judea. So that was the division between the north and the south. And then there was the exile of the north to Assyria. So the northern kingdom, they started worshiping golden calf again. They did so in the town of Bethel. And then what happened was the Assyrians came after the prophet warned them to stop doing what they were doing, and then took them captive, and they were basically in captivity in Assyria. So the northern kingdom, there was no one there. They took them all. Southern kingdom was fine. Then later on in the book, we see around Habakkuk, the exile to South Babylon. So we can see that story actually in a couple books. But again, it's the idea that now the southern kingdom goes into captivity. So we've got two captivities, north captivity, south captivity, and then we have the return to Jerusalem. So that's when everyone's leaving from Babylon. We've looked at that in a couple Sabbath studies. That's where we see King Cyrus, and then King Cyrus giving basically the order for the Jews to go back and build their temple. So what's important to notice here is at the very beginning, where we look where the Exodus is, this is when Moses first received the law and the feast days. And then we see the very last book of the Bible, which is Malachi, and Nehemiah and Ezra also overlapping with that period of time. They still practice the law and the feast days. So nowhere in the Old Testament where you will ever find a verse that says the feast days were done away with. You can see them in the beginning near Exodus, and then you can see at the end in Nehemiah. So Feast days carried on, and same with the law carried on. So if we're going to say that the biblical holy days had changed or new ones were added, or now we have Christian holy days versus Jewish holy days, we would have to look in the New Testament, because in the Old Testament, we're not going to find anything to give us that distinction. So if we take a look here, again, here's another layout of all the books, and we can see that Ezra and Nehemiah, these are like the last books of the Bible, and then we can see Malachi, Zechariah, and Haggai, they're all overlapping with those two books. So if we take a look, approximate date here, 445 BC. In 445 BC, we can tell they kept the law and they kept the feasts. And in 570 BC, there's another verse that actually talks about this in in Ezekiel. And again, they kept the law and they kept the feasts. And then we can take this all the way back to Exodus. So we do have obviously areas of the Bible where the Israelites were worshiping different gods and goddesses. We've looked at that in previous lessons. One of the gods they worshiped was Baal. One of the goddesses they worshiped was Asherah. So the Jews had went into worship foreign gods, but as a people, they still managed over time, even as they went back and forth between these idols, to still maintain their feasts and still maintain the law they received from Moses. So we're going to take a look first at a statement from the book of Ezekiel. It's coming in chapter 44. Chapter 44 has to do with new worship. So basically, we're restoring Israel at this point. In Ezekiel 44:24, it says, "If any dispute, they shall officiate as judges and judge according to my ordinances. They must observe my laws and statutes regarding all my appointed feasts, and they must also keep my Sabbaths holy." So we can see from Exodus to Ezekiel here, it wasn't just the law, it wasn't just the feasts, it's also the Sabbath. But of course, since the law has the Sabbath within it, that shouldn't be surprising. So whole Old Testament, no changes to the Sabbath, no changes to the laws, and no changes to the feast days. If we take a look in the times of Ezra, Ezra is 458 BC. Ezra returned and he taught the law. Okay, so even after the book of Ezekiel, we can still tell that the law was being taught, and this is at the end of the Bible. So if we're going to say the law was done away with, it definitely wasn't done away with in the Old Testament, because we can see the very last books of the Old Testament, they're still upholding the law, they're still upholding the feast days, they're still upholding the Sabbath. Nehemiah 8:1, "And all the people gathered as one man in the square before the water gate. And they told Ezra the scribe to bring the book of the law of Moses that the Lord had commanded Israel." So here we can see the prophet is basically going to read from the book of the law and is going to read all the laws that Moses had received. So clearly the law is still in effect. The book of the law is the Ten Commandments. You could say basically everything that Moses wrote in the Torah. If you take a look here, you can see 1500 BC is approximately when we say Exodus happened. So this is when Moses would have received the law. And then 570, we just took a look in the book of Ezekiel. They kept the law, they kept the Sabbath. And in 445 BC, in the book of Nehemiah, we saw they kept the Sabbath, or so they kept the law, which means they kept the Sabbath, and they also kept the feast days. So again, just reconfirming that all throughout the Old Testament, Sabbath, Ten Commandments, and the feast days, they were practiced all the way through. So the 9 holy days of the Bible, let's figure out what exactly these feast days were that they practiced. When we say holiday, what we're actually saying is a holy day. So let's figure out where these holy days were coming from, and let's see what some of the instructions were. Holy day number 1, we've got the Passover. This occurred in the month of Abib or Nisan, and give me a moment, I'm actually going to show you on a calendar where exactly that falls. Details, it was instructed to be on the 15th of Nisan or Abib. So the month of Abib was actually the first name, and then later on, after they went to captivity, remember we had 2 captivities, one with the north kingdom, one with the south. When they went to captivity and they were captive by the Assyrians, they adopted this word Nisan, because Nisan was one of the gods that the Assyrians had. So their month changed from Abib to Nisan. That's why you'll see sometimes 15th of Nisan or Abib. It depends on where exactly in the Bible you're reading based on their history. So the Passover is just one day, and it's followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a week. A lot of people assume the Passover is a week. There's actually a line in the Bible that kind of muddies that up as well in the Old Testament. But the Passover itself was one day, and then on the same day the Passover started, there were 7 days for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Beneath, if you want to take a look at some supporting evidence, I put all the verses, Old Testament, New Testament, that refer to the Passover. So as you can see, the Passover is referred to in both Old Testament and New Testament. It's not like it was practiced in the Old Testament and then done away with. Feast of Unleavened Bread. Feast of Unleavened Bread, also known as Matzo. It's in the month of Abib or Nisan. It starts the same night as the Passover on the 15th of Abib or Nisan, and then it goes on for the 7 days. So this is why people think Passover is 7 days. It's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is 7 days. It starts on the same night as the Passover, but the Passover is just the one evening. And then again, we see it show up in both the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The Feast of First Fruits. So Yom HaBikurim. This is again Abib and Nisan. And then we can see here the day after the Sabbath of the Passover week. It's on a Sunday, no specific date. So we know that the Sabbath is a Saturday. If it's the day after the Sabbath, that means it's the day after Saturday being Sunday. We can see this show up in the Old Testament, and we can also see the Feast of First Fruits, a reference, show up in the New Testament. Christ was actually the symbol of the first fruits. Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost or Shavuot. This fell in the month of Sivan. 7 weeks from the day after the Sabbath on the Passover, which is the first fruits. So basically you're doing a count. You're doing a count after the Passover. Shavuot always falls on Sunday, as it was always the day after Sabbath. So it usually falls in the Hebrew month of Sivan. Of course, there's a difference between our calendar today and the calendar that we're operating off of when we calculate these dates. That's why you notice that throughout the years, the dates, they move a bit. Old Testament, we can see Pentecost or the Feast of Weeks or Shavuot. And then New Testament, it also shows up in Acts chapter 2. Feast of Trumpets, also known as Yom Teruah. This happens in the month of Tishri. This is on first Tishri. We see this mentioned in the Old Testament. However, we also see that the Old Testament is pointing to the trumpets in Revelation. So while it isn't explicitly said in the New Testament, it is implied by obviously the book of Revelation and the blowing of trumpets, which is what this holiday was actually pointing towards. The Day of Atonement, and ignore the Hebrew name, that's incorrect. It's Yom Kippur. Again, this is the month of Tishri. It's the 10th of Tishri. And in the Old Testament, we have a variation. We have an abundance of different verses that mention the Day of Atonement. In the New Testament, we can also see references to the Day of Atonement. The Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths. Again, this is going to be in Tishri. This is 7-day feast intense from the 15th to the 22nd of Tishri. We can see supporting evidence for it in the Old Testament, and we can see supporting evidence for it in the New Testament. So far, every single holy day out of the 9 that we see is mentioned in both Old Testament and New Testament explicitly, with the exception of the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets is not mentioned explicitly, but it is implied by the book of Revelation. Yeah, and the Hebrew name for the Feast of Tabernacles is Sukkot. Feast of Dedication. Ignore the Hebrew name here because I was doing some copy and pasting and I didn't actually update that field. So just ignore that. Feast of Dedication is known as Hanukkah. Month is Kislev in Tevet. So the 25th of Kislev to the 3rd of Tevet. We can find details for this in the Old Testament, as well as we can see it recorded in the New Testament. Purim. Purim is called the Feast of Lots. And Purim is in the month of Adar. It's the 14th of Adar for the city and the 15th for the country. All the details for Purim can be found in the book of Esther. This celebration is actually mentioned, I believe, once in the Apocrypha, but it's not mentioned in the New Testament that I noticed. Ignore the pieces at the bottom there. That's actually a copy-paste error. So most of these biblical feast days, the 9 that you see listed in the Bible, they're listed in both the Old and New Testament, with a rare exception of maybe 2. So here's the breakdown on the calendar. If you take a look on the right, you'll see the Hebrew calendar. You'll see Nisan is a busy month, and then so is Tishri, and they sit diagonal to each other. You'll notice we have 3 holidays in Nisan: Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of First Fruits. If you remember from our previous studies, the year does not start for a Jew in January. Neither did it for a Roman or a Greek. That change came much later. New Year for the Romans and Greeks and for the Jews up until a certain period of time was always in March. March was the start of the year. I think we went through this before, where we counted with March being number 1. And once we get to September, September, septagon, 7, October, octagon, 8, November, nonagon, 9, and deca is 10. So you can see here that the original numbering of the year was the original numbering of the month, was March as number 1. So we see our 3 holidays in Nisan, 1 holiday in Sivan, which is the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. Pentecost is also where you'll probably know the story about the apostles speaking with tongues. When they spoke with tongues, they weren't just rambling gibberish like you might see in a Pentecostal church. Speaking in tongues means that you're speaking a language that someone else can identify that you yourself don't know. So for example, if I just start making weird noises with my mouth, that is not speaking with tongues. If all of a sudden I started speaking Arabic and I didn't know how to speak Arabic and someone else is obviously understanding me, that is the gift of tongues. So that was happening during Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. If we take a look in Tishri, we can see the Feast of Trumpets, we can see the Day of Atonement, and then we can see the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. That's the 7 days in the tent. So that was marking their exodus out of Egypt and the fact that when they were in the wilderness, they were in booths or tents. And then we can see the Feast of Dedication, more commonly known as Hanukkah. Feast of Dedication is mentioned in the New Testament. That's the yellow block there, and you can see it between Kislev and Tevet. And then we have the Feast of Lots, also known as Purim, that came from the book of Esther. That's the last holiday of the year, and that one shows up in the 12th month, which is Adar. So 4 holy days practiced in the New Testament. We can find Passover. Passover is mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's mentioned in Acts chapter 12, verse 3. Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, is found in Acts chapter 2. Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah, is John 10:22. If you don't see a holiday here that you're expecting to see, it means it's not actually a holiday in the Bible. These are all the feast days that are actually listed in the Bible. The yellow ones are the ones you can find in the New Testament and the Old Testament, and the ones that are in the darker gray, those are holidays you can only find in the Old Testament. So the holy days which were to be kept forever, there were certain holy days that were denoted in the Old Testament that they were supposed to be kept for all generations. They had no start date, they had no stop date. The first one was the Feast of First Fruits. As a matter of fact, you can find most of this information in Leviticus. So as you notice, when I'm reading off these different verses, they're all coming pretty much from Leviticus 23. So Feast of First Fruits, Leviticus 23 and 13. You may not eat any bread or roasted new grain until the very day you have brought this offering to your God. This is to be a permanent statute for generations to come wherever you live. So Feast of First Fruits, is there a stop point? There is no stop point. Feast of Weeks, Leviticus 23 and 21. On that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly, and you must not do any regular work. This is to be a permanent statute wherever you live for generations to come. So Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, there is no stop date on that. As a matter of fact, we see in the New Testament in Acts chapter 2, after the crucifixion, they are still practicing Pentecost. So clearly that's being upheld. Passover, Exodus 12, chapter 14. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. Again, Passover, you're going to celebrate this for generations to come, and this is a lasting ordinance. In other words, it never ends. Do we see the Passover being celebrated in the New Testament? Absolutely. We actually see the Passover being celebrated by Christ, and we know of it as the Last Supper. Feast of Unleavened Bread, Exodus 12:17. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. So Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread go together, of course, because they both start on the same day. And we can see the same command being given for both of them. Celebrate them as a lasting ordinance for generations to come. In other words, there is no end to the Passover. There is no end to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Day of Atonement, Leviticus 23:14. You are not to do any work at all. This is a permanent statute for the generations to come wherever you live. So again, we look at the Day of Atonement. This is another holy day that has no start, no stop. It is going to go on forever. Feast of Tabernacles, Leviticus 23:41. You are to celebrate this as a feast to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is a permanent statute for the generations to come. You are to celebrate it in the 7th month. So these holy days that you've seen right here, they explicitly say that this is supposed to be an everlasting statute. This has no end date. So unless you can find something in the Bible after these verses in Leviticus that say, nope, okay, these holy days are done, now we're doing something totally different, this should not be stopping. There are 6 holy days to be kept forever. We just read they were the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of First Fruits, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There were 4 holy days written of in the New Testament: the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost, and the Feast of Dedication. So if we take a look here, we can see that out of the 6 that we just looked at that are supposed to be kept forever, we can see the Passover made the list, we can see the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of Weeks. So 3 out of the 6 we can definitely see in the New Testament. So we should be asking ourselves, in regards to today, in regards to what holidays should we be practicing? Well, we know there should be at least 3, because we can see 1, they were supposed to be kept forever in the Old Testament, and then the New Testament, we can see that they're actually still keeping these holy days. The question is, were these holy days being kept before the cross or after the cross? Because did the crucifixion play a role in regards to whether we were supposed to keep these holy days or adopt new ones? That's a question that people ask. So the 3 holy days, the 3 holy days mentioned in the New Testament were practiced after the cross. So this list we just looked at here, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Dedication, 3 of these mentioned here were practiced after the cross. So let's take a look at Acts 12 first. Acts 12, 1-5 says, about that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword, and he saw that it pleased the Jews. He proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. So let's stop there for a second. If this is during the days of unleavened bread, where does the book of Acts take place? Well, we know the book of Acts comes after the Gospels. So we got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then Acts. Is Jesus alive during the book of Acts, or is this story taking place after the lifetime of Jesus? The answer is the book of Acts is taking place after the story of the lifetime of Jesus. So the question should be, well, then why are they practicing the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Well, if you've been taught that at the cross, all of a sudden the holidays were nailed to the cross or done away with, you can tell that's not true because you contradict yourself as soon as you read the book of Acts. Book of Acts, we can see there is no more Christ. He's been crucified and already taken to heaven. But we can see his followers, the apostles, the disciples, they're carrying on with their Feast of Unleavened Bread. As we carry on and read, it says, and when he seized them, he put them in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So of course we know that Passover is the start, and on the same start point we have the Feast of Unleavened Bread kickoff as well. So those 2 feast days are going off at the same time. So when we read about it in Acts, we can see, okay, well, they were obviously keeping the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is what we see in Acts 12. In 1 Corinthians 5:6, it says, your boasting is not good. Do you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast, that you may be a new unleavened batch as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival. I'll repeat that. Therefore, let us keep the festival. So this is after the crucifixion. We're talking about the Church of Corinthians. These are Greeks. These are Gentiles. And here we can see that they are keeping the Passover. All they're discussing here is how they were going to look at the symbol of the yeast, the leaven. And it says, for Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old bread leavened with malice and wickedness, but the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So this wasn't the idea that you're getting rid of the Passover. It was just understand what the symbol is. The symbol of the unleavened bread being sincerity and truth means Christ, because obviously if the old bread, the leaven, had to do with the Pharisees, that's the malice and the wickedness. So they weren't doing away with the Passover. Here we can see they're confirming to keep the Passover and just agreeing amongst themselves what exactly the unleavened bread was to represent. Acts 2, 1-4. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like a mighty rushing wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw tongues like flames of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. And when they were all filled with the Holy Spirit, began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Okay, so in Acts chapter 2, clearly they kept the day of Pentecost. Now remember, Acts is after the life and times of Christ. So when we're dealing with Pentecost, This is after the crucifixion. Of course, it's after the crucifixion because when Christ said, I must go up so the Spirit can come down, this is exactly what Christ was talking about. This is why Christ, when he was on the earth for 40 days after his death, he said he had to leave so that the Spirit could be with all of them. And that's what we see in Acts chapter 2. So here we see multiple holy days, multiple holidays, and these are practiced in the Old Testament, and then we also see them being practiced in the New Testament, and they're being practiced in the New Testament after the crucifixion. So obviously the crucifixion had nothing to do with the cancellation of any holy days. So which holy days should we be keeping today? The sixth commandment in Leviticus 23 were for all generations. We read it. There were the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of First Fruits, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There was no commandment or happening at the cross that stopped the observance of these 6 holy days, and the other 4 were practiced following the cross. So again, when you take a look at these holy days, you can see them in the Old and New Testament, and then you can even see some of these holy days are even mentioned after the crucifixion. There's really no logical reason why there should be a starting or stopping of the holy days. You might say that with the Jews versus the Gentiles, there's a difference in which days they should be keeping, but we haven't got there yet. So far, we're just trying to answer the question of, was there any kind of a command given in the Older New Testament that said the holidays have to come to an end, here's a new set of holidays, or here's a holiday set for the Jews and here's a holiday set for the Christians. Haven't hit that yet. All we've seen so far is this was supposed to be for all generations, and we can definitely see that both Old Testament, New Testament, and after the cross, these holy days were kept. Did they keep the holy days and law and the Apocrypha? Okay, so those 14 books that were in between the Bible before the days of Christ. So we're talking around 150 BC, that kind of era. Did they keep the holy days and the law? Well, we're going to assume that they did because we already jumped to the New Testament. And if they're keeping the New Testament, that gap that sits between the Old and New Testament, I would assume they did. If we take a look here, we're going to look first. The last book of the Old Testament is Malachi. So if you look over here, 450 BC to 430 BC, Malachi written, Old Testament closes. So we read from Malachi already because we looked at the book of Nehemiah, which covers the same time period. And in Nehemiah, we saw that they kept the law and they kept the feast days. So between Nehemiah and the Apocrypha, we're looking at approximately like 300 years. So we got 444 and then 165. So Judas Maccabeus is where we're looking. And it says, and the people of Israel unite to overthrow the Seleucid domination of their land and rededicate their temple. So this was what we dealt with actually last week. When we looked at the destruction of the temple, we saw there were different revolts. Well, the first revolt that we looked at was the revolt that occurred before the Romans attacked, and that was the Seleucid, or the Greeks. They came and they basically stormed the Jews during the Maccabean revolt, and then they put a statue of Jupiter in the middle of their temple. So that's what we see in 165. If we read from the book of Maccabees, we're going to see what happened during that period of time during Maccabees 1. It says, the king Antiochus Epiphanes sent letters by messenger to Jerusalem and to the cities of Judah, ordering them to follow customs foreign to their land. Okay, so here we can see there is a Seleucid king, or a Greek king, and this king is ordering the people in Jerusalem to stop following their own customs and adopt different ones. It's very important because if you're trying to answer the question of, well, why would the Jews have different holidays than the ones that are in their Bible? Here's a very good answer for you. Here you can see that there were different kings throughout history that tried to stop them from doing what they were doing. And here's one in Greece. To prohibit burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, to profane the Sabbaths and the feast days. So here we can see that if the king is ordering them to profane their Sabbaths and their feast days, that obviously means they're still practicing them. So we can see through the book of Maccabees, they must have been practicing their feast days and Sabbaths, and this obviously became a problem or a threat to the Greek Empire. It says to desecrate the sanctuary and sacred ministers and to build pagan altars and temples and shrine, to sacrifice swine and unclean animals. We talked briefly about unclean animals when we were looking at our Wednesday night Bible study. During the Wednesday night Bible study, we mentioned the fact that when we were looking in Genesis, we saw unclean and clean show up for the first time around Genesis 8, I believe. Here we're seeing that the king not only wanted them to profane their holy days and to profane their feast days, but to consume and sacrifice animals that were unfit for sacrifice. As a matter of fact, they want to put idols, Greek idols, inside of their temple. It also went on to say to leave their sons uncircumcised and to defile themselves with every kind of impurity and abomination, so that they might forget the law and change all its ordinances. So here's the nail in the coffin. The goal here of the king was to get the Jews to forget their law. And with their law, obviously, came the feast days and the Sabbath. And so we can see all this here is basically to get the Jews to separate from their identity of having the God that they follow and now obviously adopt the following of different gods that the Greeks would have adopted. Which feast days were in Maccabees? The 4 commanded in Leviticus were the ones for all generations. So actually, ignore that headline. That's a bit of a typo. The days that were mentioned in Maccabees were the Feast of Weeks. That's mentioned in 2 Maccabees 12:32. So we know they kept the Pentecost. Purim, we see that in 2 Maccabees 15:36. And the Feast of Tabernacles, Maccabees 10:1-8. That was the Feast of Tents or the Feast of Booths. We can assume the Jews kept all the feast days from Maccabees 1, chapter 1, as well as the law, since the Sabbath, circumcision, and feast days were at the center of the revolts that took place against the Greeks. Can we see the holy days and law practiced throughout the Old Testament and the Apocrypha? Well, let's look at the summary. There are 9 holy days mentioned in the Bible. 7 holy days were given to us from God. 2 were created by men. So the 2 that were created by men, one was Purim and the other one was Hanukkah. Those days weren't actually explicitly given by God. Purim didn't start until the book of Esther, which is halfway through the Bible. And Hanukkah was something that came out during the time of the Maccabees, and it was called the Feast of Dedication in the New Testament. Those 2 holy days were not given by God. 7 were given by God, and 6 of them that we saw were explicitly said to carry on forever. So there were 6 days commanded in Leviticus 23 for all generations. Those 6 were Feast of Weeks, Feast of First Fruits, Feast of Tabernacles, Day of Atonement, Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The only one missing from this list here, Feast of Trumpets. So the Feast of Trumpets was the only day not commanded for all generations, and it was one of the 7 days that God gave. The other 6 were all commanded to carry on for all generations. So the holy days were kept throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, even after the crucifixion. What details do we have surrounding the birth of Christ? Now, this stuff is all going to connect together. We have the book of Mark, chapter 1. It says, the beginning of the good news about Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, as it was written in Isaiah the prophet. I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make straight paths for him. And so John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness, preaching a baptism of repentance and forgiveness of sins. So if we start with Mark, which was the earliest book of the Bible, it's not the first book of the gospel. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but it's the earliest book of the Bible. It starts off actually with John the Baptist. So with the book of Mark, you're not going to get any details regarding the birth of Christ, because it's agreed that around the times of John the Baptist, when Jesus began his ministry, that he was 30 years old. So here, if we start from chapter 1 of Mark, we will get absolutely no details to point us towards the book of the birth of Christ, because we're dealing with Christ as an adult. If we look at the book of John, chapter 1, it's got that infamous line, chapter 1-18, talking about the Word becoming flesh. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That famous line there, that encompasses from 1-18. And then later on in the book of John, chapter 1, it says, John the Baptist denies being the Messiah. So we can stop reading there. We can see that from the book of Mark. We're not going to get any details about the birth of Christ, because Christ is too old at that point. And then if we look at the book of John, as soon as we reach John chapter 1, verse 19, we can already tell, again, we're dealing with Christ as an adult. So if we're going to talk about the birth of Christ, don't waste your time reading the book of John or the book of Mark, because there will be no details about the birth. They all start too late in his lifetime. If we look at the book of Matthew, different story. Book of Matthew, chapter 1. So if you actually take a look, you'll see I put the verse numbers beneath it, and I wrote all the ideas between the chapters, so that way you can see I didn't skip any important points. So from chapter 1, verse 1-17, Matthew is dealing with the genealogy from Abraham to Jesus. You're seeing all the jumps basically from the times of Abraham all the way through King David, all the way to Christ. That's what that block of text is dealing with. You'll also see, oops, just get this one here. You'll also see in chapter 1, verse 18 to 24, right after the genealogy, Mary becomes pregnant through the Holy Spirit, and then Jesus is named. So that's when the name Christ is actually presented by the angel to Mary. So this is all you get from chapter 1. So at this point, Mary is pregnant, but Mary hasn't actually given birth to her child yet. Now we look at chapter 2. In chapter 2 of the book of Matthew, we see that the Magi see Herod in Jerusalem, and then they go on to Jesus. So at this point, they're looking for this child that's been born. So we can look in chapter 2 then if we want to get some details specifically about the birth of Christ, because if we're going to figure out what day he was born, if we're going to figure out what time of year it is, we would have to look in chapter 2, or we'd have to see if we could figure out like what was the season in chapter 1 that Mary was pregnant, which we don't get. We see the Magi come and worship him. That's verses 9 to 12. And then we see Joseph escapes with Jesus to Egypt, and Herod kills all the children who are 2 years of age and younger. That's chapter 2, 13 to 18. And then an angel appears to Joseph in a dream, and he leaves Egypt and goes to live in Nazarene, district of Galilee. Okay, so that means they already came back from Egypt. So that means Jesus at this point is around 12 years old. So if we're going to find any information about the date that Jesus was born or the season that Jesus was born, we have to take a look in Matthew chapter 1 or chapter 2, because after that, he's too old again. So if you read through Matthew chapter 1 and Matthew chapter 2, you're not going to get any details regarding the day of his birth. You won't get any details to even give you a hint at what the season is, unless, of course, it's going to hint that it wasn't during the winter. So the next verse, actually, the next time we see Jesus mentioned in the book of Matthew, I wrote at the bottom, is Matthew chapter 3:13. At this point, once we reach chapter 3:13, again, Jesus is 30 being baptized by John the Baptist. Anytime you see John the Baptist with Christ, you already know that you're dealing with someone that's of a full adult age. So we're not going to get any details about the birth of Christ from chapter 1 or chapter 2 of Matthew. The only book left to talk about the birth of Christ at this point in the entire Bible is the book of Luke. If you can't find what you're looking for in the book of Luke, it means the details don't exist. Book of Luke, chapter 1, the birth of John the Baptist foretold. So from verse 1 to verse 25, all we're talking about is the upcoming birth of John the Baptist. Then from verse 39 to 45, we talk about Mary visiting Elizabeth. That's Jesus's mother visiting John's mother. Then from 46 to 56, there's a piece called Mary's Song. It's Mary praising the Lord. And then we see the birth of John the Baptist. That's from 57 to 66. And then in Zechariah's song, that's again John the Baptist's father. He has a song as well, glorifying the Lord. That's 67 to 80. There is nothing in chapter 1 of the book of Luke that's going to help you figure out the time that Christ was born, or the season, or any of those details. Chapter 2, there was a census. And then what happened was Jesus and his family, Joseph and Mary, they traveled to Bethlehem, and this is where Jesus was born in a manger. Since they weren't from the town they were traveling to, and there were other people traveling to that town, that was the reason that Christ didn't have a bed to lay in. Normally, Joseph being a carpenter, he'd have his own house, and we find out that he does have a house in later chapters. The only reason that Jesus was in a manger at all is because when they traveled for the government census, the hotels were all booked because lots of people were traveling to other towns. So Jesus was circumcised and named on the 8th day, and the name was provided by the angel Gabriel. So we get that from chapter 2, 1 to 21. And then if we look at chapter 2, verse 22, which is right after this piece, Jesus is now 12 years old. So we have the book of we have the book of Matthew, and we've got the book of Luke, and that is the only place in the Bible you will find details having to do with the birth of Christ. If you can't find details that have to do with December the 25th, if you can't find the Christmas tree, if you can't find giving presents, if none of that exists in these 2 chapters, it's not in the Bible. So we'll start there.
Let's look at the facts of our Lord's birth. And the first fact is he was not born in December.
First of all, there's nothing in the Bible that tells us that Jesus was born the 25th of December. In fact, we can be pretty sure he wasn't born that time of year.
He was born somewhere around the end of September or the beginning of October.
Yeah, we do get this question a lot, though, not particularly this, but all kinds of misconceptions about Christmas and the dates and everything. Start at the top.
Yeah, well, I'm a December 25th denier. I don't think I don't think December 25th is the birthday of Jesus. And, you know, I mean, that's when we celebrate it, you know, culturally. I'm fine with that. You know, we do the Christmas stuff and, you know, we have fun with it. But I don't think that this is, you know, the date that Jesus was born. I take quite a different view of that. So,
You know, like most Christians, I'd love to know the date of the birth of Christ. I'd love to know exactly when Jesus was born, but I don't. And really, that date has been lost in history. To my knowledge, there's no way to exactly, precisely recover that date.
Isn't December 25th in the Bible somewhere? Actually, it isn't. Sextus Julius Africanus was the first to suggest the date more than 200 years after when Jesus is said to have been born. Africanus was the first Christian known to produce a universal chronology, a history from the date of creation to his own time. He thought Jesus must have been conceived on March 25th, which was the day he believed the world was created. Then he added 9 months to get a December birth date, and the Roman Church didn't accept this date formally for another 100 years. They started celebrating Christmas on December 25th in the year 336 during the reign of Emperor Constantine.
So as you can see there from multiple sources, this isn't my opinion. If you look in if you look in Matthew, you look in Luke, you will find absolutely no details to explain any of these Christmas festivities that we do. We do have the 9 holy days that are outlined in the Old Testament, and obviously Christmas wasn't in there. And we do have from obviously multiple church sources. We have the head pastor from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We had examples from the Pentecostal Church, an example there from just non-denominational. That was Michael Heisner. They all unanimously agree. There is nowhere in the Bible, because we just took a look, where it actually talks about the birth of Christ in regards to a date or in regards to the festivities that we do today. So the only time that we actually see Christmas being celebrated in Rome was actually hundreds of years after the birth of Christ. And we'll get there in just a couple minutes. So birth of Christ in the Bible, only Matthew and Luke chapters 1 to 2 talk about the birth of Christ. If you think you're going to find something extra, take the 15 minutes and read Matthew and Luke. You'll only need to read the first 2 chapters to recognize that, hey, once we reach chapter 3, he's far too old to be looking for details of his birth. We do not know when Jesus was born. No date was provided or the season. We do not know any Christmas customs or mention of Christmas. We do not see any Christmas customs or mention of Christmas. So nowhere in the Bible, you won't find the idea of the Christmas wreath, the tree. Actually, we'll talk about the tree a little bit later, but you won't find the Christmas wreath or the tree or the December 25th date or any of the customs we have with the gift giving today. The time of year did not appear to be winter, as shepherds were in the field. So that's a point that comes up that people kind of gloss over. They don't really pay that much attention to. Here's the issue though. This is Jerusalem in December. So this is actually a video that I took. I thought the best way to show you that the shepherds wouldn't be in the field would be to show you that, first off, Jerusalem gets snow just like other places. It may not get snow every year, and it may not be as cold as other places, but it's still cold enough that if you were living there and you're a native to that land, chances are you're not going to be laying out in a field with your sheep. Here's another shot from Jerusalem. This is January 9th, 2019, and this is Israel in the wintertime. So this is near Mount Hermon. 1.2 to 1.5 inches of snow fell on northern Israel on Wednesday. So look, if you look at this tractor and the amount of snow there, they definitely get snow. They wouldn't just be hanging out in the fields during the winter solstice. Here's another shot of Israel. Again, it snows. Here's another one. This is actually from Jerusalem. So this is going to be very close to the climate, in fact, that these shepherds would have been enduring. And you can tell from the subway system here, it's quite a bit of snow for shepherds to lay outside in the winter. And then again, here we can see the Temple Mount area. And the tree's pretty weighed down with snow. And then again, here's another depiction of the Temple Mount area, and there's quite a bit of snow. So I'm just kind of reconfirming the idea that if you think that Israel is so warm that people could just kind of hang out in the winter in a field, not the case. It may not be as cool as Canada, but it gets cold enough so that the people there want to be indoors. So if you take a look here on the left-hand side, you can see where it says Bethlehem. On the right-hand side, you can see where it says Golden Heights. Golden Heights is fairly close to Bethlehem. If you take a look at the map there, I mean, they're not too far apart. So I would assume that whatever the temperature was in Golden Heights or whatever the weather conditions were in Golden Heights, it'd be quite comparable to what exactly they would have endured in Bethlehem, which is where our story took place. This is Golden Heights, December 2013. And again, we're dealing with the winter solstice. So if this was what Bethlehem looked like, there wouldn't be shepherds in the field. As a matter of fact, if we take a look up here, we can see here's a path going from Jerusalem up to Bethlehem of Galilee. Remember, Jesus was a Galilean, he's from Nazareth. Well, here's something very interesting to keep in mind. It takes 2 hours and 43 minutes, or 1 hour and 43 minutes by car. So 146 kilometers. I've got a common sense question for everyone watching today. If you were the leader of the Roman Empire, would you call a government census and have everyone leave from different places of Israel to come and be registered in the middle of the winter? See, if the shepherds in the field doesn't get you, you'd have to think that there's some common sense on the leadership, that there wouldn't be a Roman leader alive who'd be stupid enough to handle the backlash of telling all of his people to go out and go 100 kilometers wherever in the middle of the winter solstice. That's just absurd. So the birth of Jesus in the Bible, it is extremely unlikely that Jesus is born during the winter solstice. While we don't know the date that he was born, we can take a look at the details in regards to the climate and the idea that a Roman leader wouldn't send his people across a cold land carrying their items and such to be registered, nor would it be likely that there would be shepherds out in the field. So it looks like we don't even know the season. If we actually search through the Bible, we just look for the word Christmas, because the Bible's a big book, maybe you think that it's mentioned somewhere outside of Matthew and Luke. There's 0 results found for Christmas anywhere in the Bible. If I do a search for Easter, however, yes, I can find one search result for Easter. Easter shows up once in the Bible, which is Acts 12:4. Now, this is interesting. We had 9 biblical holidays, Christmas not being one of them, but Easter wasn't mentioned in that list. So does that mean in the New Testament they came up with a new 10th holiday? And what's that 10th holiday specifically for the Christians? It says here in Acts 12:4, and he had apprehended him and put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. You might actually recognize this line because you read it earlier. We read it earlier when we were looking at the holy days, but the only difference here is we're looking at the King James Version. Christians have one holy day mentioned in the Bible from what it looks like, and it looks like that day would be Easter, or is that a misconception? If we look at Acts chapter 12:4, which is what we just read, but instead of reading it in the English from the King James Version, let's read it in the Greek, which was the original. If we notice here, this word that has been translated as Easter, it says Pascha. It says the Passover supper, or the lamb. Okay, so that in Acts chapter 12, verse 4, the only place in the Bible we can see Easter, it doesn't actually say Easter. It says Pascha, which is Passover. It was just translated as Easter in English. If we look at Acts 12:4, notice that all the other versions, with the exception of one, translate the Passover as the Passover, but for some reason, the King James Version decides to translate the Passover as English. It's the same verse. Here we can see with the Berean Literal Bible, whom also having seized he put in prison, having delivered him to 4 sets of 4 soldiers to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. King James says, and when he had apprehended him, and he put him in prison, and delivered him to 4 quaternions. quaternions of soldiers to keep him, and tending him after Easter to bring him forth to the people. All we had here was the word Passover get switched for Easter, but in the Greek, it definitely didn't say Easter. It said Passover because it said Pascha. So if we look at the Passover is supposed to be the 15th of Nisan or Abib. Remember, the month had changed names. Passover is one day, followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a week. Okay, so what was the whole purpose of the Passover in the first place? Because we're trying to basically overlap and say, is there a connection between Easter and Passover? Are they the same thing? Did it just change names? Or did what the Jews used to call Pesha or Passover, did the Christians go on and then go to call that Easter? That's the question we have to ask right now. Christmas, we've got nothing, but Easter, we've got at least something to look at here. Is the Passover and Easter the same thing? That's the question we need to answer. Numbers 28:16. On the 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. Deuteronomy 16:1. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God, for in the month of Abib the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. So if we take a look here, we can see here's two calendars. I just put them both there so you could see that Abib and Nisan are the same thing. The calendar is rotated slightly differently, but you can tell that all the months line up with the regular months on the calendar. So whether it's Abib, Nisan, it makes no difference. Passover is always the 15th day of that month. And so we can see we have Numbers 28:16 and Deuteronomy 16:1 to affirm that. I decided to go to the Vatican's website. The best place to go for any information about church history, I think, is Vatican.va, because, of course, that's the Catholic Church. So I took a look at this website, Vatican.va, Easter 2003. And I was just reading some of the details regarding Easter because I was curious. Is there a connection between the Passover? What is this? Date of Easter, 1170. 1170 at the Council of Nicaea in 325. All the churches agreed that Easter, the Christian Passover, should be celebrated on the Sunday following the first full moon, 14th of Nisan, after the vernal equinox. Okay, so what we're seeing here is in the Council of Nicaea in 325, Easter and the Passover should be kept on the Sunday following the first full moon after the equinox, when the days and nights are equal. So what we're talking here is that's March the 21st. They're saying that you look for the first full moon after the vernal equinox, which is March the 21st, and then this is going to be our Passover or Easter Sunday. That's explicitly said by the Vatican. It says, because of the different methods of calculating the 14th day of the month of Nisan, the date of Easter in the Western and Eastern churches is not always the same. For this reason, the churches are currently seeking an agreement in order to once again celebrate the day of the Lord's resurrection on a common date. Okay, so we can tell between the Eastern Church in Rome and the Western Church in Rome. The Vatican would be the Western Church, okay? Your Eastern Orthodox, like your Greeks and Ukrainians, that's the Eastern side. So the West side here is the side where the Vatican rules. And the West side said, well, we're going to celebrate the Passover, that is Easter Sunday, on the Sunday following the full moon after March the 21st. However, there was a discrepancy between the East and the West because of how they would calculate this date. What's interesting, though, is in the final line, notice what it says. The churches are currently seeking an agreement in order to once again celebrate the day of the Lord's resurrection on a common date. That should trigger you. I'll read it again. The churches are currently seeking an agreement in order to once again celebrate the day of the Lord's resurrection on a common date. And if you're like, well, what are you triggered by the idea that there's two different dates? No. I'm triggered by the idea that it just said that the Passover or Easter has to do with the Lord's resurrection. I don't recall the Passover having anything to do with the Lord's resurrection. Let's keep looking. The Vatican is associating Easter to the resurrection. You just read it. Passover is about the angel of death passing over their houses in Egypt. That's what it was about. They would take blood of a lamb, they would paint the door red with the blood of a lamb, and then the angel of death in the book of Exodus would go over the houses and wouldn't touch those animals and wouldn't touch those people. And instead, the Egyptians, they lost their firstborn and they lost their firstborn animals. And that was during the time of the Exodus. So we're not equating Passover to the resurrection in any way, shape, or form. We're equating the Passover to the passing over of the houses in Egypt. I mean, hence where the name Passover comes from. So I think we have a disconnect here. The Passover to the Jews has to do with what happened in Exodus. The Passover or Easter to the Catholic Church has become something totally different, which is the resurrection of Christ. Let's keep going. Christ died during the Passover, not resurrected during the Passover. Remember, the Passover is just one day. So both the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread started at the same time. Christ died during the Passover. So what happened was Christ didn't die during the Passover. Christ first ate the Last Supper. Then during that day, he was crucified. But his resurrection story, he died during the Passover, but he was not resurrected during the Passover. I should have read my original note. So Christ died during the day of the Passover, because remember, it starts evening to evening as a day. Well, you had the Passover during the night. That's the Last Supper. And then during that day, you had the crucifixion. So Christ died during the Passover, but then he resurrected 3 days later. Christ resurrected on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. Well, Sunday is not the Passover. The Passover is one day. That means that he resurrected during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He didn't resurrect during the Passover. So it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Once you understand, that's why I want to go through all these Hebrew holidays. Once you understand that the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread start at the same time, but the Passover was only one day and the Feast of Unleavened Bread carried on for 7. Well, if Christ died and was resurrected 3 days later, and the Passover is one day, he obviously wasn't resurrected during the Passover. It would have to be during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is a very important detail because, of course, remember, when we looked at what the Vatican said they're seeking an agreement in order to celebrate the day of the Lord's resurrection on a common date. And what do they call the day of the Lord's resurrection? They call it Easter. So, major problem here. Deuteronomy 16:1. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover to the Lord your God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. I'll read it again. The Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. Okay, so where's the resurrection here? See, we're seeing the date in regards to when we're supposed to keep the Passover. We're seeing the month. We're seeing what it was supposed to commemorate, but none of that had to do with the resurrection. And keep in mind, there was no Christ in the Old Testament. So there was a divide between the Eastern Church and the Western Church. And the two names that came on the scene were the Bishop of Rome, and then we had Polycarp, the Bishop of the Church of Smyrna. So they couldn't agree on a date. I'm going to show you some of the dialogue that they had to show you how exactly they came up with this date. So the first debate, this started in 155 AD. So again, if the Passover was going to be celebrated on Sunday the way we celebrate it today, this didn't even start until almost 100 years after Christ. Polycarp, the bishop of the Church of Smyrna, Eastern, and Pope Anticidius, bishop of the Church of Rome, Western, disputed over the Passover. Polycarp emphasized that the Passover was a traditional custom handed down from Jesus, saying that he had been celebrating the Passover every year together with John, one of Jesus' disciples, and many other apostles. In this dispute, however, they failed to persuade each other. So here we have the Eastern Church trying to persuade the Western Church and say, hey, look, you're messing up the Passover. It says, in 155, Polycarp argued the question with Pope Anicetus, but as neither could persuade the other, they agreed to differ. So here we see in 155, this is when East and West Rome are disagreeing on the date of the Passover. That's first part. The second debate came up in 197 AD. Subsequently, around 197 AD, Victor, Bishop of Rome, insisted that the churches should adopt the Roman practice of celebrating the Holy Supper on the Resurrection Day instead of Passover. I'll read that again. The churches should adopt the Roman practice of celebrating the Holy Supper on the resurrection day instead of Passover. So I told you, I said, when we looked at the Passover, there is no way that Christ could have resurrected on the Passover because he died on the Passover and spent 3 days in the ground before he resurrected. Since the Passover is 1 day, impossible. So here we can tell from this quote right here, it is absolutely evident now that the Passover was changed. The Passover was changed to the resurrection day. Accordingly, he called it the Dominical rule or the Lord's rule. Okay, so this was a church rule they put in place and compelled all the churches to accept it. This led to the second controversy. The churches in the West agreed to follow the rule, but the churches in the East greatly opposed it, especially Polycrates. The bishop of the Church of Ephesus sent a letter to Victor in which he strongly emphasized that the Passover should be celebrated. So here we can see that the East Church, even though the church in the West says, hey, we have the authority, we just passed this rule, we're going to have the resurrection day be in place of the Passover. Polycrates from the East Church says, no, I strongly emphasize that we should keep the Passover celebration. So the West was not keeping the Passover celebration. They just changed to the resurrection day. The East was saying, we need to shift what we're doing and maintain the original Passover. It says, but a difference had arisen between East and West. In Asia, the all-important date was the 14th of Nisan. Well, wasn't the 14th of Nisan the date that we were supposed to celebrate? Of course it was. So that was what the East said. And then celebrate the Eucharist. In the West, however, the fast was maintained until Sunday following the 14th of Nisan, and then only was the Paschal Eucharist celebrated. Okay, so here's the change. The change came in from the West. The change came in from the West where they decided we should move the Passover, whatever day it falls on, to Sunday, which is the resurrection day. Polycrates' letter to Bishop Victor regarding the keeping of the Passover at the correct time. When Victor received this letter, he planned to excommunicate all the churches in Asia by accusing them of being non-Orthodox. However, he could not achieve his plan because of objections from many churches around him. It says, all these observed the 14th day of the Passover according to the gospel, deviating in no respect but following the rule of faith. Moreover, I, Polycrates, who am of the least of you all, who am I of the least of all of you, according to the tradition of my relatives, some of whom I have followed, for there were 7, my relatives bishops, and I am the 8th. And my relatives always observed the day when the people, i.e. the Jews, threw away the leaven. I therefore, brethren, now am 65 years in the Lord, who have conferred with the brethren throughout the world and have studied the whole of the sacred scriptures, am not at all alarmed at those things which I am threatened to intimidate me, for they are greater than I, have said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So here what you see is Polycrates saying specifically, hey, I'm nothing, I'm nobody. But let me tell you something. In my 65 years of being around here serving the Lord, I've watched the Jews throw away their leaven at the same time, and I'm not threatened or intimidated by what you're doing. I would rather obey what God told us to do than keep these traditions of men. And in this case, what Polycrates is saying is the West Church of Rome is making up a tradition, and they're replacing the Passover with Easter, and they're tying it to the resurrection. And here he's saying, I want nothing to do with this tradition. I will not obey it. I'll obey God over top of this. Bishop Victor's attempt to excommunicate the churches which kept the Passover. So obviously when this communication came to Bishop Victor, he wasn't happy because he wanted his authority to be listened to. And so here we can see what is his move. He just tries to get rid of all the churches that don't accept this new date for Easter or this new date for the Passover. Upon this, Victor, the bishop of the Church of Rome, forthwith endeavored to cut off the churches of all Asia, together with neighboring churches, as heterodox from a common unity. And he publishes abroad by letters and proclaims that all the brethren there are wholly excommunicated. But this was not the opinion of all the bishops. So Bishop Victor decides, well, if there's going to be some churches that decide they're not going to accept our power and they're not going to accept this new Sunday Easter Passover, well, you can tell them that they're all excommunicated from the church. However, the problem was not all the other bishops agreed with him. Recordings of the Dominical rule and the further controversy on keeping the Passover. A more important stage of the controversy took place in 197 at Rome. There, Pope Victor, a man of much more dominating temper than Anicetus, determined to put a stop to all the confusion and to compel the whole church to accept the Dominical rule: observe the feast on Sunday. Conferences were held at various places in East and West, with the result that the Dominical rule was accepted everywhere except in Asia. Victor thereupon pursued his advantage and excommunicated and recalcitrant churches. This, however, raised a storm of protest. So here we can see they just basically steamrolled. West Rome just said, you know what? I don't care. We're going to set up a bunch of conferences. We'll eventually win you over. And whoever doesn't get won over, in this case, Asia, you're just kicked out. The Passover was abolished in the Council of Nicaea in 325. We read that earlier. The council, convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine, decided in favor of the Church of Rome. So, in other words, you had a choice between West Church and East Church. East Church says you can't switch it to Sunday. That's not what the Jews said. West Church says, I've got the authority and I don't care. Here we can see that Constantine went with the West Church. I've got the authority and I don't care. The Passover would be abolished and the Holy Supper would be kept on the Resurrection Day. And here it says, the Church in the East held that Easter should be celebrated on the 14th day of Nisan, the date of the Passover according to the Jewish calendar, no matter what day of the week it fell upon. So, of course, since we have a Roman calendar, and before they had a Jewish calendar, they knew that obviously the dates of the Passover would change. It still does today. And the argument of the East Church was, we don't care what day the Passover falls on, regardless of what day of the week the Passover falls on, that's the day of the week we're going to celebrate it. Polycarp of Asia, who was the one who came up with the view I just described, was opposed in this view by the Roman bishop Anicetus, who believed that Easter should be celebrated on the Sunday following the 14th of Nisan. Okay, so there was no communication in the Bible saying that Sunday has a biblical authority in deciding the date of the Passover. So for the West Church to decide that they're going to move the Passover to the Sunday following the 14th of Nisan, well, there's no biblical scriptural authority to allow it. So who's correct in this battle, the East or the West? Obviously the East. The Eastern and Western segments of the church could not arrive at any agreement until the Council of Nicaea in 325, when the viewpoint of the Western church was adopted. So are we actually celebrating the Passover when we keep Easter, if we follow the way that the Vatican has basically carved this out? The answer is absolutely not. You changed it. It goes on. The Passover abolished during the Council of Nicaea. With the Passover, including the Feast of Unleavened Bread, abolished, there was no biblical standard to determine the date of the resurrection day. I'll read that again. With the Passover, including the Feast of Unleavened Bread, abolished, there was no biblical standard to determine the date of the resurrection day. So in other words, at this point, you can just make it up. The council subsequently also decided in favor of celebrating the resurrection on the first Sunday that comes after the full moon of the vernal equinox. We read that on the Vatican's website. We read that directly from Vatican.va. So they came up with this final conclusion, which was, all right, March the 21st, the vernal equinox. We'll look for the first full moon, and the first full moon following that vernal equinox, that Sunday will be the resurrection day. That Sunday will now be Easter, the Passover. Does this line up with the Bible even slightly? Not even a bit. This decision was made with the excuse that it was difficult to calculate the date of the feast according to the movements of the moon. Okay. For the first century followers of the young rabbi from Nazareth, the Passover Seder was much more than just a memorial of Israel's deliverance from the bondage of Egypt. So here, what do we read? We read this earlier when we were taking a look at, I believe it was Deuteronomy or Exodus. It specifically said, when talking about the Passover, that it was Israel's deliverance from the bondage of Egypt, which we can see here too. The Feast of Passover was a memorial representing their own deliverance from the bondage of sin as a result of Yeshua's sacrificial death. Luke records that it was during Yeshua's observance of this very Passover Seder that Yeshua told his disciples, do this in remembrance of me. During the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, despite the church's rejection of the Passover, many Christians continued to celebrate this appointed biblical festival with Jewish congregations on the 14th of Aviv, or Abib. So this is really interesting. Here we're seeing it's not just the Jews that are practicing the Passover on the date of the Jewish Passover. The Christians were also practicing the date of the Passover on the date of the Passover. It was the church that changed it to Sunday. It says, but the Catholic Church authorities' toleration of this Jewish practice soon ended. The observance of the Passover was banished by church authorities as they sought to distance themselves from the Jewishness of the first century faith, which was once for all delivered to the saints. Here's the important part. At the Council of Nicaea in 325, church authorities agreed to abolish the divine appointed festival of Passover and replace it with what Constantine called the more legitimate festival of Easter. Okay, so we've got 9 holy days in the Bible. Do we have a 10th one for Easter? Well, no. Why not? Well, because Easter was supposed to be the Passover. But is it actually the Passover? No, it was changed. Okay, so do we have a Christian holiday called Easter? No, we just have a holiday that the church made up, and they made it up and confirmed it in 325 AD, and that's why we have Easter. It has no connection to any of the biblical holy days. So the question arises, does the Pope, does a bishop, does anyone, does an apostle, do any of the disciples, did anyone actually have the capability to get rid of a holy day or change a holy day? You can, obviously we can see we can make a new holy day, because we saw the Jews did it with Purim, and we can see they also did it with Hanukkah. They created their own holy day. But can you actually change an existing holy day? Can you change an existing holy day that God says you are to keep for all generations, change the date and then change the custom? The answer is no. Constantine wouldn't have the power. The Pope wouldn't have the power. The Bishop of Rome wouldn't have the power. The Jews wouldn't have the power. The only individual that could change the date of something he said would never change would be God himself. So do the Christians actually have a holiday called Easter? No. Does the church have a holiday called Easter? Yes. Is there any support for this in the Bible? Absolutely not. And the church fought about it themselves. Second question is Christmas. Christmas is an easy one. It's not even listed in the Bible, so we don't have to go through all this work to figure out the history. Christmas just wasn't listed. There wasn't a date. There wasn't a name. We don't even know where the name Christmas came from. So the outcome of Easter at Nicaea, that's the West Church, Easter is calculated as the first Sunday after the paschal full moon that occurs after or on the vernal equinox, March 21st. If the full moon falls on a Sunday, then Easter is the following Sunday. This is why the date changes every year. This is why you'll notice that, hey, sometimes I've got Easter and it's showing up in April and mid-April, and then I'm seeing Easter near the end of March, but there's quite the span in between them. And it has nothing to do with difference in calendars. That has to do with this weird calculation they're doing. The holiday can occur anywhere between March 22nd and April 25th, right? Quite the range, almost a month. The Western Church does not use the actual or astronomically correct date for the vernal equinox, but a fixed date. So they're not even going by astronomy. If you're going to say, oh, well, they're going by this practice in the Old Testament of when they're looking at the new Sabbath moon. No, they're not, because they're using a fixed date. So the fixed date obviously wouldn't have to do with the moon at all. Find the first full moon after March the 21st, and that Sunday will be Easter. If you can find me that in the Bible and where that's basically equated to the Passover, I will give you $1 million. It does not exist. This was something that came up much, much later in history, and as I mentioned, no one had the right to do what they did. If Easter was based on a change by the church to Passover observation, and Christmas is not in the Bible, neither do we know the birth date of Christ, Christians have no holy days. Unless you're going to bring in St. Patrick's Day and explain to me somehow this fits in with a festival that Christ provided you, you have no holy days. The only holy days that Christian will say are Christian holy days are going to be Easter and Christmas. Well, newsflash, Christmas is not in the Bible, and Easter was supposed to be the Passover, but they changed it, so you've got nothing now. Every holy day was listed in the Old Testament except for Hanukkah. So every one of those 9 days was listed except for Hanukkah. Hanukkah came later. So Hanukkah we see in the New Testament, and we also see it in the book of Maccabees, kind of where we get things started. Easter was only written once in Acts, and the KJV translation, in the KJV translation, King James Version, but the word Passover was translated for Easter instead. Easter doesn't even follow the same day as Passover and was based off of a church ruling in 325 AD, aligning Easter with the resurrection on Sunday. But of course, we know Christ didn't resurrect during the Passover. He resurrected during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Christmas isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. If it was going to be, you'd have to find it in either Luke or in the book of Matthew, chapter 1 and chapter 2. We have no idea when the birth of Christ was, as nothing was said in Matthew or Luke chapters 1 and 2. Jesus was not born during the winter solstice because there were shepherds in the field at night, and no Roman leader in his right mind would have people travel for a census hundreds of kilometers in the middle of the winter. As a matter of fact, when I was reading through this and studying like yesterday and today, I thought to myself, I'm like, who cares about the shepherd? If you imagine someone like Justin Trudeau saying, hey, all of you guys go for a walk to Calgary in the middle of the winter, that sounds like the stupidest order ever. I can't imagine anyone who is fit to rule to be doing something so stupid. But Christians don't need to celebrate Jewish holy days. This is another debate that I hear quite often. So in other words, we have holy days that are for the Christians, holy days that are for the Jews, and the Christians don't need to celebrate the Jewish holy days. But what do we already find out here? The Christians don't have any holy days. Once we take away Easter and once we take away Christmas, there's nothing left for you to celebrate. If you reject the Jewish holy days, that means that you just live a life without holy days. Numbers 9 and 14. If foreigners living among you want to celebrate the Passover to the Lord, they must follow the same decrees and regulations. The same laws apply to both native-born Israelites and to foreigners living among you. Okay, so could foreigners, people who were non-Jews, could they celebrate the Passover? According to the book of Numbers, they could. If you were living amongst the Jews, if you were living with them in Judea, you could celebrate the Passover, but the same rules that apply for the Jews would also apply to you, the foreigner. Numbers, same verse, typo with the verse. Here's another verse. It's not Numbers, I think it's Deuteronomy. The assembly is to have the same statute for both you and for the foreign resident. It is to be a permanent statute for generations to come. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord. The same law and the same ordinance will apply to both you and the foreigner residing among you. Here's two different verses. So did the foreigners have like one way of serving God, and then of course the Jews have a different way of serving God? Or would the foreigners put on a Passover one way, and then the Jews would put over a Passover a totally different way? No. If you're a foreigner and you're going to celebrate these holy days, you were expected to keep the exact same law and the same ordinances that apply to the Jews. There's no separation. Leviticus 24 and 22. You are to have the same standard of law for the foreign resident and the native, for I am the Lord your God. So again, we're getting from Leviticus 24. You can't say, okay, Jews, this is what you have to do, and then Christians or foreigners, you can do something lesser, or you can do something different, or you can put sparkles on it this way. No, if you're going to celebrate it, you do it the same way that we do. Otherwise, don't bother. Romans 3:30. Since there is only one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through the same faith. Okay, so the Jews, we knew they had circumcision. We know in the New Testament, the Greeks, the Romans, they weren't circumcised. As a matter of fact, they abhorred it. They thought the whole practice was just deplorable. But we can see here that whether you're circumcised or non-circumcised, meaning whether you're Jewish or non-Jewish, you're all the same through your faith. So it's not about, remember, we talked about the circumcision of the body. We're not talking about the physical circumcision here. The circumcision of faith is the circumcision of the heart. That was the actual circumcision God wanted. God wanted you to stop being so stubborn. God wanted you to stop having such a hard heart. He wanted you to cut the hardness from your heart and accept that what he said was truth and that he was God. Exodus 12:48-49. If a foreigner resides with you and wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover, all the males in the household must be circumcised. Then he may come near him to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. but no uncircumcised man may eat of it. The same law shall apply to both the native and the foreigner who resides among you. Okay, so then we get a little more detail here. It wasn't just the foreigners that could come and celebrate the Passover, and it wasn't just the foreigners who had to celebrate the Passover in the exact same way that the Jews did. We found that they also had to be circumcised men. So here we can see in the Old Testament, if there was someone who wanted to practice the Passover like a Jew, they had to be circumcised, and they had to keep all the laws and do everything the same way that the Jews did. Colossians 3:11, now we're jumping to the New Testament. It says, here there is no Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave or free, but Christ is all and is in all. So here we're seeing there's no difference whether we deal with Greeks or Jews, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarians, slaves, free people, etc. You're all the same. You're all the same in your faith. So what we're noticing here is there's a discrepancy. We see a change in the Old Testament from the New Testament in regards to what circumcision is. In the Old Testament, you were not eating that Passover meal unless you were circumcised and you kept it like the Jews did while you lived amongst them. In the New Testament, we see that the circumcision of the flesh is not as important anymore. 1 Corinthians helps us out. 1 Corinthians 5:7-8 says, cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Now, what's important to recognize here is this conversation is with the church of the Corinthians. Now, the Corinthians are a church in Greece, and this church in Greece is saying, let's keep this Passover. But the church in Greece, they aren't circumcised, and they didn't get circumcised, but they still kept the Passover. Romans 2:27-29. A man who is physically uncircumcised, but who fulfills the law, will judge you who are a lawbreaker, in spite of having the letter of the law and the circumcision. So here what you can see is Paul is saying that, look, people who are uncircumcised, people that are not Jews, they're not related to Abraham, but they keep the law, they will judge you. Even though you are circumcised and you are the blood of Abraham, these Gentiles will judge you. For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, and true circumcision is not something visible in the flesh. On the contrary, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, by the Spirit, not the letter. Okay, so what are we seeing here? What's Paul revealing? Paul's revealing the idea that's like, look, you don't need to get circumcised. As a matter of fact, circumcision isn't going to do anything. Circumcision is not going to circumcision isn't going to stop you from breaking the 10 Commandments. You can get circumcised, you can still go out there and you can break every single law. It's not going to make a difference. And on the other hand, we can have Greeks, we can have Romans. These individuals, they're not going to get circumcised. But guess what? If they keep the law, they're better than the rest of you. It has nothing to do with the outward mark on the skin. It has to do with your obedience. So in the New Testament, when we talk about Jews, are we talking about people necessarily related to Abraham? Not necessarily. A Jew in the New Testament is redefined as someone who has faith in Christ. Grace by faith, right? Faith in Christ. That's the circumcision of the heart. This is why the Corinthians were allowed to have the Passover. This is why the Gentiles are allowed to have the Passover. It's not the fact that today, in 2020, we need to go and get circumcised for men for us to eat the Passover feast. That's not true. No, we have to have faith in Christ, perhaps a baptism. We follow him as a disciple. Now you've been circumcised of the heart. You are now a spiritual Jew. Some of you might have heard the idea of Jews for Jesus. Well, it's true because, of course, if you're a Gentile that accepts Christ, the Bible refers to you as a spiritual Jew. The New Testament redefines a Jew as not being related to Abraham or even circumcised for that matter. 1 Corinthians 7:19 says, circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commandments is what matters. Notice the commandments of God are still being upheld even after the cross in 1 Corinthians. We know 1 Corinthians is after the book of Acts. So this is after the cross. So here's something I want to point out. There's a lot of Christians today that talk about Sunday and they say the law's been done away with. And I can give them verses for days and they still won't listen. Well, here's another one. Keeping God's commandments is what matters, not your circumcision or uncircumcision. So when you read this and you understand that this verse occurs after the crucifixion, how could you possibly stand so confidently beside the idea that the law has been done away with? It makes no logical sense. Summary. The foreigners living among you, the Jews, had to keep the same law as the Jews, 10 commandments that were given to Moses. Okay, so the law was supposed to be kept by the foreigner, and the law was supposed to be kept, obviously, by the chosen people. Foreigners could participate in the Passover in the Old Testament if they were circumcised. The Corinthians, who were uncircumcised Gentiles, participated in the Passover. We read it. Jews are no longer children of Abraham in the New Testament, but those both Jew and Gentile with hearts that were circumcised to Christ in their faith. So, of course, we redefine what a Jew is. Once you reach the New Testament, it's no longer, well, I come from the bloodline of Abraham, and I'm from the tribe of Dan, or I'm from the tribe of Simeon, or I'm from the tribe of Judah, or I'm from the tribe of Levi. It has nothing to do with that anymore. This is about obedience at this point. Okay, so we asked, when did Christmas first originate? And we can tell that it must have originated much, much later in time, because the early church fathers, they wrote nothing of it, and they wrote down lots of their feasts. We can see in Catholic Encyclopedia, volume 10, 1911, Mithraism, a pagan religion consisting mainly of the cult of ancient Indo-Iranian sun god Mithra. It entered Europe from Asia Minor after Alexander's conquest spread rapidly over the whole Roman Empire at the beginning of our era. It reached its zenith during the 3rd century and vanished under the repressive regulations of Theodosius at the end of the 4th century. Okay, that's interesting. So in Rome, it looks like we have a competing religion. At the exact same time, we see that Christianity is starting to come out here and get some legal rights, and Christians aren't being fed to lions anymore. Simultaneously, we have another religion that's being practiced in Rome. Now, this shouldn't be surprising, considering in our last couple Sabbath studies, what did we find happened when the Roman rulers had basically destroyed the temple and taken over the Temple Mount? They built a temple to Jupiter. So it shouldn't be surprising that we can see right up to the 4th century, they have some other kind of a god, some other kind of a deity. So we've got, it looks like one hand of emperors in Rome, and they're going towards this Christian faith and paving the way for the Christian faith. And the other side of Rome, these other emperors, they're all still caught up in what they were doing before, which was this worship of these different sun gods. It says, Helios, Mithras is one god. So here we have two names. Helios was the name that the Greeks gave him. Helios is actually where you get the word hell from. So you can tell the word hell is associated to the worship of the sun. Helios, hell. So Helios, Mithra. So Helios was the Greek name, Mithra was the Persian name, is one god. Sunday was kept holy in honor of Mithra. And the 16th of each month, was sacred to him as a mediator. That's really interesting. So look at the similarities here. Here we have the Catholics. Remember, this is the Catholic Encyclopedia. They're saying that Mithra and Helios, or Mithra was worshipped in the Holy Roman Empire. They're saying that Mithra is the same thing as Helios. They're saying that Sunday was the day that they honored Mithra, and they also called him a mediator. I thought Christ was a mediator. And I remember in the Old Testament in Ezekiel, it said that wouldn't it be in the future that Christians would start to worship the sun? Well, here's a sun god. His name's Mithra or Helios, and Sunday was his day of worship. And also, he was a mediator. This looks like we're having an overlap with a counterfeit. It looks like we have Christianity and sun worship, and the two have some similarities. Is it possible then that these quote-unquote Christian holidays and the Christian Sabbath or the Lord's Day, maybe these actually come from the worship of Mithra and Helios, considering we've seen that ingrained through the Roman history going back since before Christ and after? It says the 25th of December was observed as his birthday, the Nautilus Invicti, the rebirth of the winter sun, unconquered by the rigors of the season. Okay, so let me get this straight. Mithra was worshipped in Rome prior to Christ. Mithra was worshipped in Rome after Christ. Mithra was a sun god. Mithra was honored on Sunday. Mithra was observed having a birthday on December the 25th. Are you sure Christmas has anything to do with the Bible, or are you actually just adopting the older religion of Rome? And if you are adopting the older religion of Rome, wouldn't that mean that you're doing exactly what Ezekiel said, which was in the future, the people would be worshiping the sun? 320 AD. This is from Heijmans from 2003. This is actually a professor from the University of Alberta, and I've spoke to him directly. He said, all of this would be minimal importance were it not that December the 25th was first celebrated in Rome as the birth of Christ in the 320s. Okay, so wait a minute. You're telling me that first you guys are worshiping Mithra, and you're worshiping Mithra, the sun god, into the 4th century, and then in 320 AD, that's when you first decided that Christ had been born on December the 25th? A little late in history. 350 AD, Catholic Encyclopedia from 1908 says, Pope Julius I was the Bishop of Rome from 6th of February 337 to his death on the 12th of April 352. He is notable for asserting the authority of the Pope over the Arian Eastern bishops, as well as setting the 25th of December as the official birth date of Jesus. So again, Christ died around 33 AD. Why did it take you another 300 years to figure out what his birth was? And keep in mind, there's nowhere written in the Bible. So where are they pulling these dates from? Considering that there was already a God worshipped in Rome both before and after Christ, and those dates overlap both Sunday and December the 25th with that God, I think at this point it should be quite evident where Christmas came from, or at least part of its origin, because Christmas is actually an amalgamation of several deities. 274 AD. So now we're going backwards. Remember, 350 AD is when they made it so that Christ's birthday was on December the 25th. But look what happened in 274 AD. This is on page 55, Historische Portraits von Caesar bin Justinian. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, was the official sun god of the later Roman Empire and the patron of soldiers. The Temple of the Sun was a temple in Campus Agrippae in Rome built by Aurelian, and on the 25th of December, 274, the Roman Emperor Aurelian dedicated the temple to Sol. So in other words, the first time we see December the 25th show up in Roman history is when we see the Roman Emperor Aurelian. He builds a sun temple, and the sun temple was dedicated to Sol. And what you're going to find out very quickly is that Sol, or Sol Invictus, is the same thing as Mithra, which is the same thing as Helios. The god was favored by emperors after Aurelian and appeared on their coins until the last third part of the reign of Constantine. Okay, so right up through Constantine, we can see that this god was on the Roman money. If we actually take a look here, here's 274 AD. We can see the Roman Emperor Aurelian, he's on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, there's the sun god. There's Sol Invictus. So Aurelian built a temple for Sol Invictus in 274 AD, dedicated it to him on December the 25th, which is when we celebrate Christmas. Here's some pictures of Sol Invictus. On the left, we can see the Roman eagle, and then behind the Roman eagle, we can see Sol Invictus, and you'll notice there's a ring around his head and then rays like the sun. There's another one on the right-hand side. Now you can see where the Statue of Liberty came from. It's the exact same thing. Masons brought their ideology from the East all the way to North America. That's why the Statue of Liberty looks identical to Sol Invictus. Now you understand why the nations that were founded by Freemasons celebrate Christmas. Because, of course, the nations that were founded by Freemasons have the same symbolism as what we see in ancient Rome. Here we can see Sol, the sun god. Again, we see the halo around the head, and then we see the rays of light that look like rays from the sun, or those prongs like the Statue of Liberty. This is 313 AD. This is Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine is supposed to be a Christian emperor, but take a look at this. Roman Emperor Constantine, and on the other side of the coin, what do we see? The sun god Mithra. Wait a minute, this is Mithra. Look at Mithra. If we look at the right-hand side of this coin, notice we've got this deity, Sol Invictus. He's got this pointy crown on, and he's got this kind of a whip in his hand. What's the difference with Mithra? They're identical, the pointy crown and the whip in the hand. Did the religion of Rome actually change, or was it just something that it seemed like on the outside to others? Because it looks like this worship of the sun, whether it be by Mithra or Helios or whatever other names they want to use, it didn't actually stop, at least among the ruling class. Here we can see some more depictions of Mithra. On the left, we can see Mithra. Now this looks a lot like Sol Invictus with the ring around the head and the points of light. And then we can see the zodiac, and in the center of the zodiac, we can see Mithra being pulled by a chariot. And again, around his head, we can see the rings of the rays of the sun. Now, when we compare this Mithra in 313 AD, and we compare this to Sol Invictus, we're seeing the exact same deity. Tomato, tomato. So perhaps in earlier times of Rome, they used the name Invictus. In latter times of Rome, they used the name Mithra, and go back far enough and you'll see names like Apollo. If you'll notice here, you'll see he's got the rays of the sun around his head, Mithra that is, and then you can see the 4 horses pulling him. He's pulled in a chariot. And then again, same thing. This is Sol Invictus. We've got the rays of the sun extending from the head, and again being pulled in the chariot by the 4 horses. There is no question. This is the exact same deity. It was worshipped in the same place. 315 AD. This is again, University of Alberta, Heijmans. Temples and priests of Sol in the city of Rome. Constantine might not have patronized Christianity alone. He built a triumphal arch in 315 to celebrate his victory in battle of the Milvian Bridge, which was decorated, and here it is, with images of the goddess Victoria, and sacrifices were made to pagan gods at its dedication, including Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. Absent from the arch are any depictions of Christian symbolism. So figure this out. We've got Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine's not even 30 years from Aurelian. Aurelian had the same god on the coin that Constantine did, and they're only 30 years apart. And then here we see Constantine, who's supposed to be this champion of Christianity. What is he doing? Well, he's building arches and dedicating them to pagan gods such as Apollo, Diana, and Hercules. I already brought up, who's Apollo? Apollo's another sun god. 321 AD, Justinian's Code, Corpus Juris Civilis. On March 7th, 321, Sunday, which was sacred to the Christians as the day of Christ's resurrection, look at this part, and to the Roman sun god Sol Invictus, was declared an official day of rest. On that day, markets were banned and public offices were closed except for the purpose of freeing slaves. Okay, so here's a coincidence. Not only do we have Christmas listed nowhere in the Bible, here we have the Roman sun god Sol Invictus having his birthday on December the 25th. At the same time, though, we see in March of 321, Sunday, which was dedicated to the Christians as the day of Christ's resurrection, the Lord's Day, it was also the day dedicated to Invictus. So is there a difference between the Sabbath and the Lord's Day? Absolutely. Sun Day, the day of the sun, Sol Invictus, the sun god that was worshipped in Rome prior to Christianity and after the Christianity by the leaders who helped pave the way for Christianity. So what actually are you seeing with Sunday and Christmas? The worship of a solar deity. Were other gods celebrated in Rome on December the 25th? You bet there were. World Book Encyclopedia, copyright 1966. And 354 AD, Bishop Liberius of Rome ordered the people to celebrate on December the 25th. He probably chose this date because the people of Rome already observed it as the feast of Saturn, celebrating the birthday of the sun. Okay, so what names do we have? We have Helios, okay? We have Apollo, we have Mithra, we've got Sol or Sol Invictus. That's 5 different names for the same thing. And what were they? They were all sun gods. Every single one of these were sun gods. And now we've got Saturn. Saturn was also on December the 25th. And what is he? He's also a sun god. Notice how Rome has a history of worshiping the sun. It would make a lot of sense that if there were things that were injected into the Christian faith that had nothing to do with the pages of the Bible, where else do you think it would come from if it wasn't from the religion that was being presented to people both before and after Christ had lived. Were other gods worshipped on December the 25th? Saturn was worshipped on December the 25th exactly. Sol Invictus had a temple dedicated to him on December the 25th. Mithra was celebrated on December the 25th. Sol Invictus was the same god as Mithra. Another name is Helios. Saturn, Sol Invictus, Mithra were all sun gods that were all worshipped in Rome prior to Christianity. Are you starting to see what happened here? Here's Saturn. Saturn was typically depicted in a chariot in the sky being pulled by these two one-eyed serpents. Here's Mithra. Now, I realize that these aren't two one-eyed serpents, but are you noticing a theme here with the sun gods flying through the air in a chariot being pulled, all being worshipped on December the 25th, with Sunday being dedicated to them? Are we starting to see a theme here? Here's the god Odin on the left. This is from Norse mythology. He's flying through the air on a horse being pulled by wolves. If we look here, we can see Thor. Thor is being pulled on a chariot with goats. Here's Odin. Odin is what became Santa Claus. All they did was they changed Odin from wearing a blue gown like a druid to now wearing a red and white gown like a druid. And the red and white, we've already discussed what the red and white was about. The red and white represents the Amanita muscaria mushroom. That was the mushroom that grew specifically under the Christmas tree found in Siberia that the reindeer would eat and they would get high. And that's why we've always depicted reindeers as flying, because anytime you deal with anyone flying in mythology, it means that drugs or pharmakia was involved. They got high. So when you're looking at Santa Claus, you're looking at Odin, but you're looking at Odin dressed up as a red mushroom. Odin, Thor, Saturn, Helios, Apollo, Sol Invictus, Mithras, these are all gods you're seeing being pulled through the sky in a chariot. You'll even notice that Odin has the Christmas tree tucked in his back and a bunch of gifts. This is actually the god Nimrod. This is where they got this from. So this later depiction we have of these Norse gods or Greek gods or Roman gods, this goes all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis, we had this leader, this king called Nimrod, and Nimrod built this tower to Babel. I'm going to read the subtext. After Nimrod's death, approximately 21767 BC, Semiramis promoted the belief that he was a god. So his wife said that Nimrod was a god. I hope he doesn't die. She claimed that she saw a full evergreen tree spring out of the roots of a dead tree stump, symbolizing the springing forth of new life for Nimrod. So what was Nimrod? Well, he must have been a nature god. So Nimrod himself was the tree. Nimrod was the tree because, of course, once the tree was dead, what sprung out of it? Nimrod did. So it's the reincarnation of the old tree. So Nimrod is some kind of a forest god. He's some kind of a vegetation fertility god, but you can see he's associated to nature worship. On the anniversary of his birth, Nimrod would visit the evergreen tree and leave gifts under it. His birthday fell on the winter solstice at the end of December. When's the winter solstice? December the 24th. So you can see all these sun gods, what they're actually pointing back to is this archetype of of Nimrod. Nimrod became later what looks like Mithra and Saturn and all these other gods. And you can see Nimrod is also holding the reindeer in his hand. If Christ is a God of truth, how do we worship him? By lying about his birthday, having an ancient sun god take credits for gifts your parents give you, and then making the lie as convincing as possible by eating cookies and leaving notes. This seems like the complete opposite of how you would worship a God of truth. If you're saying that God can be trusted, you can put your faith in God and God will never deceive you, and that's the work of the devil, you should start to kind of question, where exactly did this holy day come from? It's not a holy day of the Christians. We can't find it anywhere in the Bible. And the way we uphold the holy day as a Christian, supposedly, is we blend it with Christ's birth, but we don't actually know the date of Christ's birth. But the worst part is even though we don't know the date of Christ's birth, everything about the celebration of Christmas is based on a lie. That's the part I find the most interesting. The fact that when you go back in the history, you can find out that Santa obviously had nothing to do with the Bible. And Santa is definitely connected to the prior religion that was worshipped in Rome before Christianity, and also the worship that carried on in Rome of pagan sun gods after Christianity. I also find it interesting that in the Bible, there was only one time that Jesus ever got mad. Jesus never showed his anger. He never lashed out. He used sarcasm here and there with the Pharisees, but he didn't get angry. The only time in the Bible that Christ got angry is when they set up money tables inside of the temple. So they were doing commerce. They were doing commerce inside of the temple. And then that's when Christ came in and he grabbed the tables and flipped them over. And he said, my temple will not be a temple of commerce or temple of exchange, basically. But the irony is this: what time of the year do we spend the most money typically? When are we the most materialistic? I would say birthdays and Christmas. Well, ironically, we've struck them both with Christmas. While we say that Christmas is the birthday of Christ, we celebrate it through the thing he hated, which was materialism. And the second piece is we say that Christmas is the birth of Christ, but at the same time, it wasn't. And that's when we're doing all this, when we're going through all these different expenditures. It's almost like we've taken what was going on with the money changers and we've made that his birthday. It seems like the most offensive thing you could possibly do if you knew his character. The question, though, is it all a coincidence? You have to look at the situation. This is to be the biggest lie orchestrated in all of history. Because when you think about it, the government, the military, teachers in schools, media, and parents all lie about Santa's existence. Is there anything else in your life, whether it's child or an adult, where you'd be lied to more than this one specific event? The fact that you're actually associating the birth of God to an event that is the largest orchestrated deception I've ever seen, that just seems completely kind of absurd. What I think is really funny, though, is we know in the Bible that there is a character called the father of all lies. Who's the father of all lies? The devil, Satan. So isn't it kind of interesting that we've got Saturn, which can be turned into the word Satan, because Saturn or Saturn was based, this is actually where we get the word adversary from. It was, the belief was the word Satan actually came from Santanus, and Santanus had a connection to Saturnus, and Saturnus was Saturn. So isn't it really interesting that Saturn, the god of time, who is the god of death, this is the individual that we have all these different organizations, governments, military, schools, media, they all lie about the existence of the god of death on the supposed birthday of the god of life. That, to me, it's too perfect. If there was ever proof that Satan exists or that the devil exists, I would say if you actually took the time to study as much of the holiday of Christmas as you could and all the things surrounding it, you're going to find the idea that's like, is Satan Jupiter? Is Satan Saturn? Is Satan these different sun gods? And the answer is quite likely. What I find also interesting is the idea that if you lie to your child once, it's like one of those things where it's like, okay, well, no big deal. But look how many times you're doing it. So watch how this works. If your children trust you more than anything else, what effect psychologically could telling your children that Santa exists when he doesn't, what kind of psychological effect could that have? If your children trust you and then they find out that you and your friends and your friends' friends and everyone else, they all just played a big orchestrated trick on you because they thought you were young and stupid, you're probably not going to be as trusting as as trusting with your parents as you were before. Like you just obviously had you just had your mind kind of twisted. Another thing that adds to it is when we talk about the Easter Bunny. So we've got first Christmas, then we've got the Easter Bunny, two lies in a row, both of which are associated in the Bible, but both of which cannot be found in the Bible. At least with Easter, you can say, well, it's loosely connected to Passover, which it isn't. But you added like a bunny, you added like think about it, it's a rabbit that lays eggs. What mammals, aside from a duck-billed platypus, is going to lay an egg? There's so many things that are wrong with this. So it's just interesting to see the progression here. First, you lie to me about God's birthday, and the truth is you didn't even know when God's birthday was. But you all thought it was kind of cute to basically, I don't know, take advantage of a youth because it was just a fun initiation that we all go through. But then after that, you give me the Easter Bunny. And obviously I found out the Easter Bunny is not true. Then maybe you give me the Tooth Fairy. Normally, when someone lies to you once, twice, 3 times, you stop trusting them. So here we have 3 lies. And these 3 lies are all lies having to do with the spiritual world. The spiritual world in the sense that the Easter Bunny, we think they live in some spiritual place. Santa Claus lives in the North Pole in some spiritual place, right? And then we have this idea of the Tooth Fairy. I guess they live in some kind of fairyland as well. So we have 3 ideas that are of the spirit realm, right? Something that doesn't physically exist. We find out all 3 don't exist. What do you think is going to happen to your child when they become a teenager and you say, Jason, I need you to believe that Jesus, our God, died on the cross and resurrected for your sins? Do you think that's going to be easy to swallow? You fed me this garbage of Santa Claus. Then I got the Easter Bunny, a rabbit that lays eggs. Then you hit me again with the Tooth Fairy. And then you actually want me to believe that someone died and came back from the dead. Are you kidding me? See, you can see psychologically the damage this can do. So we will celebrate Christ's birthday, not in the Bible, by destroying our child's faith in God and then confusing them. That's ultimately that's what we're agreeing to. We can say it's cute. We can say we've always done it. We don't even know the origins of where it came from, most of us. But ultimately, what we're confirming is this. We're going to continue to celebrate Christ's birthday that's not in the Bible by destroying our children's faith in God and confusing them at the same time. That's what we're doing. That's outwardly what we're doing, whether we want to admit it or not. So the interesting part is we're ultimately destroying a spiritual sense that a child has before they even reach their teenage years. You're not even a teenager, and you will not listen to the idea of someone dying and coming back to life because your parents just hit you with 3 bullets, and all of society did too. And 2 of those bullets came from the same book, and 2 of those bullets aren't even in the book. Now, here's the funny part. Do you think that your children will get older, and do you think they'll research that Christmas wasn't in the Bible, and the Passover was changed to Easter with rabbits laying eggs added later? Or are you telling me that you knew that Easter was a church tradition distorting the Passover? Did you know that before today? I don't think you did. Or did you know that Christmas wasn't in the Bible and the sun god of Rome showed up both before and after Christ and it was blended with Christ? You probably didn't know that until today. And if you did, you probably learned this later in life. What I'm trying to say is that if you didn't know and you went on your whole life thinking that these things were in the Bible, chances are your children do too. And so if you're hearing for the first time today, hey, there's no Easter in the Bible. Hey, there's no Christmas in the Bible, and this shocks you. Well, what do you think the response from the children would be who you taught?
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.